Boston Archdiocese clergy abuse scandal. In 2002, reporters at the Boston Globe's Spotlight team exposed a long-running pattern of child sexual abuse by Catholic priests in the Archdiocese of Boston and a systematic cover-up by church leaders. Their first major story focused on former priest John Guillogan, who had been accused by dozens of victims of molesting children over several decades. Court records and internal church documents showed that archdiocesan officials, including Cardinal Bernard Law, quietly moved accused priests from one parish to another instead of removing them from ministry or reporting them to police. Over time, the investigation revealed that at least 5 priests in the Boston area were criminally prosecuted and convicted, while the Archdiocese paid tens of millions of dollars in settlements to hundreds of victims, forcing the sale of church property and major financial restructuring. The Boston revelations demonstrated that abuse and cover-ups were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern in the Catholic Church. The scandal triggered investigations across the United States and in other countries, as victims came forward with similar accounts of priests abusing minors and bishops protecting offenders by transferring them rather than alerting civil authorities. Ravi Zacharias and RZM sexual abuse scandal. In 2020, after the death of Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias, multiple women came forward with claims of sexual abuse and coercion connected to his ministry activities. In response, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, or RZIM, commissioned an independent investigation by the law firm Miller & Martin. In February 2021, the final report confirmed that Zacharias had engaged in a long-term pattern of sexual misconduct, including unwanted touching, exposing himself during massages, and pressuring women into sexual activity. Investigators also found evidence that he used ministry funds to provide gifts, housing, and financial support to women in ways that enabled ongoing abuse. The investigators documented hundreds of photographs on Zacharias's devices, anonymized payment records linked to victims, and testimony showing that he used his spiritual authority to isolate and manipulate women. The report also stated that Zacharias misled ministry colleagues and donors for years by denying earlier allegations, creating false narratives about accusers, and using non-disclosure agreements to prevent scrutiny. Following the report, RZIM publicly acknowledged that its founder had engaged in extensive wrongdoing and announced major organizational changes, including halting international operations and restructuring its leadership. The scandal undermined the credibility of the global apologetics network Zacharias had built and raised widespread questions about accountability structures within large religious organizations. Jim Bakker, PTL scandal, and Silver Solution. Fraud. Jim Bakker's first major scandal centered on the PTL, Praise the Lord ministry, and Heritage USA, a Christian theme park he developed in the 1980s. PTL sold far more lifetime lodging memberships than the resort could ever accommodate, creating an unsustainable financial scheme. An investigation showed that PTL funds were misused to cover operating losses, while Bakker and other leaders received sizable personal payouts. Federal prosecutors charged Bakker with multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy for soliciting millions of dollars from supporters under false pretenses. He was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to prison for violating federal wire fraud and mail fraud laws. Decades later, Bakker faced a second major financial scandal involving the promotion of Silver Solution, a colloidal silver product sold on The Jim Bakker Show. During the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, Bakker and his guests claimed on air that the product could treat or cure the virus. State attorneys general, the FDA, and the FTC ordered him to stop making medical claims, stating there was no scientific evidence that colloidal silver could cure any illness. Bakker was sued by Missouri's Attorney General for deceptive practices and eventually settled, agreeing to stop selling the product as a medical treatment and to provide refunds to customers. Hinn, Prosperity Gospel Finances and Ministry Spending. Hinn became one of the most recognizable televangelists through large healing services and international television broadcasts. Over time, scrutiny intensified around his ministry's financial practices, especially the way donor money was used to support personal and organizational expenses. Federal investigators began examining Hinn's operations as early as 2007 as part of a U.S. Senate inquiry into whether certain televangelists were misusing tax-exempt funds. While the inquiry did not result in formal charges, it documented patterns of spending that included luxury hotels, chartered jets, and high-cost travel arrangements paid for with ministry resources. Former staff members and relatives also provided accounts of internal financial practices. Hinn's nephew, Hinn, who worked closely with him for years, publicly described the ministry as centered on prosperity gospel fundraising techniques that encouraged large donations in exchange for promised spiritual or financial blessings. He stated that ministry funds routinely supported luxury lifestyles for leadership. In later interviews, Hinn acknowledged that some of his teachings on prosperity had been excessive and stated that he no longer endorsed certain fundraising tactics his ministry had used in earlier decades. LDS Church, Ensign Peak advisors, hidden investment fund, and SEC violations. In 2019, a whistleblower report submitted to the IRS stated that Ensign Peak advisors, the investment arm of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, had accumulated more than $100 billion in assets while filing regulatory documents that did not accurately describe the size or structure of its holdings. According to the complaint, Ensign Peak avoided public disclosure by dividing its portfolio among multiple shell companies, each reporting only a small portion of the total, thereby obscuring the scale of the church's investments. In February 2023, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission announced an enforcement action confirming that Ensign Peak and the church's leadership had violated federal securities laws. The SEC found that the church directed Ensign Peak to create and use 13 shell LLCs to file separate Form 13F reports, giving the appearance of multiple independent entities rather than a single manager overseeing tens of billions in assets. The Commission determined that these filings were false and misleading because they concealed Ensign Peak's role and the true size of the portfolio. The church agreed to pay a $1 million penalty, and Ensign Peak agreed to pay $4 million. The enforcement order noted that concealment began around 1997 and continued for more than 2 decades. While the SEC did not allege misuse of funds, the case centered on regulatory transparency. Large institutional investment managers are legally required to disclose holdings accurately to ensure market integrity. The ruling made clear that the church's reporting structure was designed to avoid public scrutiny of its investment growth and management practices. Greater Ministries International, religious investment fraud and Ponzi scheme. Greater Ministries International, based in Tampa, Florida, operated a large-scale fraudulent investment program throughout the 1990s that promised donors dramatic financial returns through what leaders described as a faith-based doubling of money. The organization solicited funds through presentations in churches and small groups, telling participants that their contributions would be multiplied and returned because of God's laws of giving. In reality, the program functioned as a Ponzi scheme. Money collected from new participants was used to pay earlier investors, while leadership diverted significant funds for personal use. Federal investigators determined that Greater Ministries had taken in more than $500 million from approximately 18,000 people. The ministry produced no legitimate profits and kept the operation functioning by continually recruiting new contributors. When inflows slowed, the system collapsed. In 1999, federal agents shut down the organization and arrested its leaders, including founder Gerald Payne. Court records showed that the group used religious language and promises of divine blessing to create trust and reduce skepticism, making the scheme effective within church networks. Payne and several associates were convicted on charges including money laundering, mail fraud, and conspiracy. Sentences ranged up to 27 years in federal prison, reflecting the scale of financial loss and the deliberate use of religious authority to conduct fraudulent activity. The case became one of the largest church-related financial crimes prosecuted in the United States. Southern Baptist Convention, SBC, abuse reporting failures and institutional cover-up. Beginning in 2019, a series of investigative reports and survivor testimonies revealed that leaders within the Southern Baptist Convention, SBC, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, had failed for decades to respond adequately to clergy sexual abuse. Journalists documented hundreds of cases in which pastors, volunteers, or church staff were convicted of or credibly accused of sexual offenses. Many offenders were able to move from one congregation to another because the SBC's decentralized structure did not include a system for tracking abusive ministers or alerting churches to past misconduct. In 2021, SBC messengers voted to authorize an independent investigation into how the denomination's executive committee had handled abuse allegations. The resulting 2022 report by Guidepost Solutions determined that senior executive committee leaders had, over a period of years, resisted reforms, dismissed or demeaned survivors, and prioritized minimizing legal liability over protecting church members. Internal emails and memoranda showed that leaders maintained a private list of accused ministers while publicly claiming that the SBC could not track offenders due to local church autonomy. The Guidepost report identified more than 700 names on that internal list, including individuals with criminal convictions. It concluded that the executive committee had repeatedly declined to act, even when multiple survivors reported similar patterns of abuse. Following the report, the SBC released the list publicly and began developing new policies for abuse prevention, including creating a database to track individuals credibly accused of sexual misconduct. The investigation marked a major institutional reckoning within the denomination. Magdalene laundries, forced labor, institutional abuse, and church-state collaboration. The Magdalene laundries were residential institutions in Ireland, operated primarily by Catholic religious orders from the late 19th century through the 20th century. These institutions housed women and girls who were labeled fallen, wayward, or morally suspect. Many were placed there for reasons such as having a child outside marriage, being victims of abuse at home, or simply being considered difficult by family members or state agencies. These women were required to perform unpaid labor, most commonly in commercial laundries that generated income for the institutions. Investigations by Irish authorities and researchers found that conditions inside the laundries were harsh and highly controlled. Daily routines involved long hours of physically demanding labor, restricted communication with the outside world, and limited access to education or personal freedom. Corporal punishment and psychological control were commonly reported. Many women remained in the institutions for years, and some lived the rest of their lives there, buried in unmarked graves without family notification. A 2013 government report confirmed that the laundries operated with significant support from the Irish state, which referred women to the institutions through courts, welfare agencies, and hospitals. The report also verified that the government had financially contracted with the laundries for commercial laundry services, further entangling public systems with church-run labor operations. Following the report, the Irish government issued a formal apology and established compensation schemes for surviving women. Religious orders, however, declined to contribute financially to the state's redress program. Gateway Church, Robert Morris, financial secrecy and criminal sexual abuse. Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas, grew into one of the largest megachurches in the United States under the leadership of founding pastor Robert Morris. Over many years, questions arose about the church's financial transparency, including the use of non-profit entities connected to Morris, internal spending controls, and the level of oversight exercised by Gateway's board. Former staff and members described a leadership structure in which financial decisions were concentrated among a small group of executives, making it difficult to assess how donor funds and church resources were being allocated. In 2024 and 2025, the focus on Gateway Church intensified when Morris was criminally charged in Oklahoma with multiple counts of lewd or indecent acts involving a child, stemming from abuse committed in the 1980s. In October 2025, he entered a guilty plea to 5 felony counts. Under the terms of the plea agreement, Morris received a 10-year sentence, with a portion to be served in county jail and the remainder suspended with probation. He was also required to register as a sex offender and pay restitution to the victim. The guilty plea formally established his culpability and led to widespread reevaluation of Gateway's leadership culture and accountability systems. The combination of governance concerns and Morris's criminal conviction prompted renewed public scrutiny of large independent megachurches, especially those operating without externally enforced financial or pastoral oversight. Gateway Church began reassessing its leadership structure following the legal outcome, but questions remained about how internal controls had functioned during Morris's decades of influence over the organization. Hillsong Church: leadership misconduct, financial irregularities, and organizational collapse. Hillsong Church, founded in Australia and later expanded into a global network, experienced a series of crises beginning in 2020 that exposed both leadership misconduct and weaknesses in financial oversight. The first major event was the removal of Carl Lentz, pastor of Hillsong, New York City, after internal investigations confirmed an extramarital affair and documented additional breaches of pastoral conduct. As internal reviews expanded, multiple former staff members reported workplace concerns, including patterns of overwork, inequitable treatment, and blurred boundaries between pastoral authority and personal influence. Financial scrutiny intensified as leaked documents and whistleblower reports described ministry spending on luxury accommodations, high-end travel, and entertainment expenditures charged to church accounts. In Australia, parliamentary inquiries examined whether Hillsong's internal accounting systems adequately distinguished between personal and organizational spending. Financial reports presented to regulators showed inconsistent documentation of reimbursements and travel costs, raising questions about compliance with nonprofit governance standards and tax laws. Hillsong Global's leadership responded by commissioning audits, restructuring its board, and initiating a series of resignations. Founder Brian Houston stepped down in 2022 after separate investigations determined that he had violated the church's code of conduct in incidents involving inappropriate interactions with 2 women. These events, combined with financial and organizational concerns, led multiple Hillsong campuses worldwide to sever affiliation with the global network. By 2023 and 2024, Hillsong had significantly contracted, with local congregations rebranding or closing as the organization attempted to stabilize operations under new executive leadership.
Want to understand the Bible more deeply? Keep growing in God's Word. Watch this next video.